The December snow fell like confetti outside my living room window in Springfield, Ohio, each flake catching the amber glow of the streetlights that lined Maple Street. At 72, I'd grown accustomed to the weight of silence in this house, the kind that settles between the walls after 43 years of marriage ends with a funeral. Linda had been gone 14 months now, and Christmas morning felt different without her humming carols while she prepared the turkey. My son Christopher had insisted on hosting Christmas at his house this year. "Dad, you shouldn't be alone," he'd said over the phone, his voice carrying that particular tone of forced cheerfulness I'd begun to notice more often. His Tudor-style home in the affluent Riverside district always felt like a museum to me. Marble countertops that gleamed like ice, leather furniture that seemed too pristine to actually sit on. I arrived at 10 in the morning, my worn Buick looking embarrassingly modest next to Christopher's gleaming BMW and his wife Ashley's Mercedes in their circular driveway. The house buzzed with the controlled chaos of Christmas morning. My granddaughter Emma, now 16, barely looked up from her new iPhone as I entered, while 12-year-old Mason gave me a distracted hug before returning to his gaming console. Christopher worked as a financial consultant for a prestigious firm downtown, the kind where success was measured by the weight of your watch and the thread count of your shirts. At 38, he'd achieved everything Linda and I had dreamed our children might accomplish. Yet something had shifted in him over the years since her death. Where once there had been warmth, now there seemed to be calculation. "Harold, come sit down," Ashley called from the kitchen, her voice bright as tinsel but somehow just as artificial. She moved through their space with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to entertaining, though I noticed how she avoided prolonged eye contact. The kitchen island was laden with an elaborate spread, imported cheeses, artisanal crackers, and sparkling cider served in crystal glasses. We gathered around their massive Christmas tree, its branches heavy with ornaments that looked professionally placed rather than accumulated through years of family tradition. I thought of the humble Douglas fir Linda and I had chosen each year from Peterson's tree lot, how we'd argue playfully over where to hang the angel she'd inherited from her grandmother. "Dad, we have something special for you this year," Christopher announced, his voice carrying an odd resonance that made the children look up from their new gadgets. He disappeared into the garage, returning moments later with a wooden chair, an antique ladder-back design with worn spindles and a rush seat that had seen better decades. But something was immediately wrong. One of the back legs sat at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, making the entire piece tilt precariously to one side. The room fell silent except for the soft jazz playing from hidden speakers. Ashley's smile froze in place, while Emma's eyes widened with what looked like second-hand embarrassment. Christopher set the chair down carefully, steadying it with one hand to prevent it from toppling over completely. The broken leg made a scraping sound against their hardwood floor, a noise like fingernails on slate. "Like you, it can't stand anymore," he said, his words falling into the room like stones into still water. The statement hung there, suspended between us like a challenge, while Ashley's face drained of color and she busied herself unnecessarily with rearranging the cheese plate. The casual cruelty of it settled in my chest like winter fog, cold and invasive, yet I found myself momentarily speechless. Emma looked mortified, her teenage sensibilities acute enough to recognize that something had shifted in the family dynamic. Mason's gaming sounds seemed suddenly too loud, filling the space where words should have been, where explanation or apology might have lived. I stared at the chair, its broken leg jutting out like an accusation, and felt something settle deep in my bones. Not quite understanding, not yet, but a recognition that this moment would prove significant in ways I couldn't yet fathom. The morning light streaming through their bay windows seemed different now, sharper somehow, illuminating details I hadn't noticed before. The way Christopher's jaw was set just slightly too tight, the way Ashley's movements had become overly precise. "Christopher," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the confusion swirling through my mind, "I'm not sure I understand." He shrugged, a gesture that seemed calculated to appear casual but carried undertones of something I couldn't quite name. "It's just an old chair, Dad. Thought you might appreciate something with character, something that's seen better days." His laugh had an edge to it that made Emma wince visibly. "Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. This story is just beginning, And the truth behind that broken chair runs deeper than anyone could imagine. The drive home from Christopher's house felt longer than usual, the broken chair secured awkwardly in my back seat with bungee cords, its damaged leg wrapped in an old towel Ashley had insisted I take. The Ohio winter landscape blurred past my windshield, bare cornfields stretching toward the horizon, farmhouses with smoke curling from their chimneys, the familiar comfort of rural America that had shaped my 72 years on this earth. My mind kept drifting back to Linda, as it often did during these quiet moments. She would have known how to handle what happened today. Linda had possessed an uncanny ability to see through pretense, to cut straight to the heart of matters that left me fumbling for understanding. "Harold," she used to say, her voice gentle but firm, "sometimes people show you who they really are. The question is whether you're willing to see it." I remembered the Christmas when Christopher was 12, how he'd saved his allowance for months to buy Linda a small ceramic angel for our tree. His face had glowed with pride as she unwrapped it, tears gathering in her eyes as she proclaimed it the most beautiful ornament she'd ever seen. That angel still sat in a box somewhere in my basement, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, waiting for a Christmas tree that would never come. Back then, our house had been the center of holiday celebrations. Linda would spend weeks preparing, her kitchen alive with the aromas of cinnamon and nutmeg, brown sugar and vanilla. Christopher would help her roll out pie crusts, his small hands dusted with flour, while she told him stories about her own childhood Christmases in rural Kentucky. Those were the days when family meant something deeper than obligation, when love expressed itself through presents rather than expensive gifts and cutting remarks. As I pulled into my driveway on Maple Street, the modest ranch house that had sheltered 4 decades of my married life seemed to welcome me back with open arms. The neighbors still had their Christmas lights up, the Johnsons with their tasteful white LED strands, the Martinez family with their cheerful multicolored display that their 3 young children had helped arrange. Normal families, I thought, families where Christmas gifts came wrapped in affection rather than veiled cruelty. Inside, I set the chair in my living room, studying it more carefully in the lamplight. It was actually a fine piece of craftsmanship, probably from the 1940s, with the kind of solid construction that modern furniture couldn't match. Someone had cared for this chair once, had sat in it for family dinners or quiet evening conversations. The broken leg seemed almost intentional now, as if it had been damaged specifically for this purpose, though I couldn't fathom why anyone would deliberately sabotage such a beautiful piece. I called my neighbor Eugene Martinez, a retired carpenter who'd helped me with various projects since Linda's death. Eugene had emigrated from Mexico 30 years ago, built a successful contracting business, and raised 3 children who still visited him every Sunday without fail. His understanding of family ran deeper than bloodlines. It was built on respect, kindness, and genuine care. "Merry Christmas, Harold," Eugene's warm voice greeted me over the phone. "How was your day with Christopher?" "That's actually why I'm calling," I said, then found myself hesitating. How do you explain that your own son had given you a broken chair with a comment about your inability to stand? How do you voice the growing suspicion that something fundamental had shifted in your family dynamics? "Eugene, if someone gives you a piece of furniture that's deliberately broken, what do you make of that?" There was a long pause. Eugene had known Christopher since childhood, had watched him grow from an eager boy who helped with yard work to the polished professional who rarely visited anymore. "That depends, my friend. Was it broken by accident, or does someone want you to think about being broken?" His words settled in my stomach like cold coffee. Eugene had always been perceptive about human nature, perhaps because his own journey to America had taught him to read between the lines of what people said versus what they meant. I said slowly, "I need to understand some things about my son that I've been avoiding." After I hung up, I sat in my recliner, the same chair where Linda used to curl up beside me during winter evenings, where we'd plan our garden for spring and discuss Christopher's future with such hope. The house felt different now, charged with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Outside, the December wind rattled the windows, and I found myself wondering when exactly my relationship with my only child had become something that required investigation rather than simple acceptance. The broken chair sat across from me like a riddle wrapped in wood and good intentions gone wrong. Something told me this was just the beginning, that Christmas morning had revealed a crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about my family, The question was whether I had the strength to discover what lay beneath. The following morning arrived gray and bitter, with ice crystals forming delicate patterns on my kitchen window like nature's own attempt at Christmas decoration. I'd spent a restless night thinking about that chair, about the way Christopher's voice had carried when he delivered his cruel observation, about Ashley's carefully neutral expression. Something nagged at me, a feeling I couldn't quite name that settled between my shoulder blades like an old injury awakening to weather changes. I called my friend Walter Peterson, who owned the tree lot where Linda and I had bought our Christmas trees for 23 years. Walter was 75, sharp as a tack, and possessed the kind of practical wisdom that comes from decades of observing people during one of their most emotionally charged times of year. "Harold, good to hear from you." Walter's gravelly voice came through the phone. "How was your Christmas? Christopher treat you right?" I found myself pausing again, that same hesitation I'd felt with Eugene. "Walter, you've known Christopher since he was a boy. What's your honest impression of how he's changed over the years?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. I could hear him moving around his workshop, the familiar sounds of wood being arranged and tools being set aside. "Harold, you asking me this question tells me you already know something's not right. That boy used to help you pick out trees, remember? Used to argue with you about which one was the perfect shape. Last few years, when I've seen him around town, he carries himself different, like he's measuring the cost of everything, including conversations." That afternoon, I decided to take the chair to Eugene's workshop in his garage. The walk over was only 2 blocks, but the chair was awkward to carry, and I found myself stopping twice to rest. Each pause reminded me uncomfortably of Christopher's words about my inability to stand. Was I becoming the frail old man he seemed to see? Or was there something more calculated behind his observation? Eugene's garage smelled of sawdust and honest work, tools arranged with the precision of a man who understood that good craftsmanship required respect for your equipment. He examined the chair carefully, running his weathered hands along the grain of the wood, testing the joints, studying the break in that back leg. "Harold, this wasn't an accident," he said after several minutes. "Look here. See how clean this break is? This leg was sawed most of the way through, then snapped the rest of the way. Someone wanted it to look like it failed naturally, but they made sure it would fail." My stomach tightened. "You're saying someone deliberately sabotaged this chair?" "I'm saying someone took a perfectly good piece of furniture and made sure it couldn't function properly. The question is why?" Eugene looked at me with concern creasing his brown eyes. "Harold, who gave you this chair?" I told him about Christmas morning, about Christopher's comment, about the strange atmosphere in that perfect house. Eugene listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. "My friend," he said when I finished, "in my culture, we have a saying. Cuando alguien te muestra quién es, créele la primera vez. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time. Your son showed you something yesterday. The question is what you're going to do with that information." That evening, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, thinking about patterns I'd been ignoring. Christopher's visits had become increasingly infrequent since Linda's death, and when he did come by, the conversations felt performative rather than genuine. He'd ask about my health with the efficiency of someone checking items off a list, inquire about my finances with slightly too much interest, and leave with the relief of someone completing an unpleasant obligation. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. It was Ashley, her voice carefully modulated in that way I'd noticed the day before. "Harold, I wanted to call and make sure you got home safely yesterday. Christopher was worried about you driving with that chair in your car." "I managed fine, thank you," I said, then found myself adding, "Ashley, can I ask you something? Was that chair Christopher's idea, or did you know about it beforehand?" The pause was telling. When she finally spoke, her voice was even more carefully controlled. "Harold, Christopher thought it would be meaningful. He said you'd appreciate something with character." "Character," I repeated. "Is that what we're calling it?" Another pause. I think maybe Christopher's been under a lot of stress lately. Financial pressures, work demands. Sometimes people say things they don't mean." But as I hung up the phone, I realized that Ashley's explanation felt as carefully constructed as everything else about that perfect house. The more I thought about it, the more I suspected that Christmas morning hadn't been spontaneous at all. It had been planned, orchestrated, designed to send a message I was only beginning to understand. The broken chair sat in my living room like a question mark, and I was starting to realize that finding the answer might require me to examine truths about my own family that I'd been carefully avoiding for months. The next morning brought a crystalline January dawn, the kind that makes everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. I decided to take a walk downtown, partly for the exercise my doctor was always recommending, but mostly because I needed to think, and movement had always helped me process difficult thoughts. Springfield's main street still retained the charm of small-town America. Locally owned shops with hand-painted signs, the old courthouse with its weathered limestone facade, and Murphy's Diner where the coffee was strong and the conversations honest. Inside Murphy's, I settled into a corner booth with a cup of their house blend and watched the morning regulars filter in. Small towns operate on networks of information that flow as reliably as the Scioto River, and I realized I needed to tap into that current. My retirement from 30 years at the electrical plant had left me somewhat isolated from the daily pulse of community gossip, but Linda's death had taught me that isolation could be dangerous. Betty Murphy, who'd owned the diner for 23 years, came over with the coffee pot and that particular expression that said she had something to share but was waiting for the right opening. "Harold, honey, how are you holding up? I know the holidays are hard without Linda." She refilled my cup with practiced ease, her eyes kind but curious. "Getting by," I said, then found myself adding, "Betty, you hear things in this place. What do people say about Christopher these days?" Betty glanced around the diner, noting who was within earshot, then leaned in slightly. "Harold, you know I'm not one for gossip, but," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's been talk about some of his business practices. Nothing specific, mind you, but Jim Hendricks mentioned that Christopher tried to sell him some investment that didn't sound quite right. High pressure, promising returns that seemed too good to be true." My coffee suddenly tasted bitter. Jim Hendricks was 78, a widower living on Social Security, and a modest pension from the steel mill. He'd be exactly the kind of client an unscrupulous financial advisor might target. Did Jim invest with him? No, thank goodness. His daughter Susan talked him out of it. But Harold, that's not the only thing. Mary Collins was in here last week, mentioned that Christopher had approached her about some complicated financial product after her husband died last year. She felt pressured, said he kept calling her, wouldn't take no for an answer. The pattern emerging made my stomach clench. Christopher targeting elderly clients, recent widows, people vulnerable and desperate for someone to trust with their financial security. People like me. After leaving the diner, I drove to the public library, a solid brick building that had served Springfield for 70 years. The librarian, Janet Walsh, had been Linda's friend from their church circle, and she greeted me with genuine warmth. "Harold, what brings you here today? Research project?" "Something like that," I said. "Janet, if someone wanted to learn about financial advisors, how to check their credentials, complaints against them, where would they look?" Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too professional to pry directly. Instead, she led me to one of the computer terminals and helped me navigate to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority website. "You can look up any licensed advisor here," she explained. "See their employment history, any disciplinary actions, customer complaints." My hands felt clumsy on the keyboard, but I managed to type in Christopher's name and his firm's information. The results loaded slowly, and what I saw made the room feel suddenly cold. 3 customer complaints in the past 18 months, all involving unsuitable investment recommendations for elderly clients. 2 had been settled out of court, 1 was still pending. Janet read over my shoulder, her expression growing concerned. "Harold, is everything all right? This is your son's record, isn't it?" I printed the pages, my mind racing. The complaints painted a picture of high-pressure sales tactics, complex investment products sold to clients who didn't understand the risks, and promises of returns that hadn't materialized. One complaint specifically mentioned exploitation of clients' recent bereavement and emotional vulnerability. That afternoon, I called my old friend Frank Kowalski, who'd worked in the bank's loan department before retiring 5 years ago. Frank had always been good at reading people, at spotting the difference between genuine need and calculated manipulation. "Frank, I need your opinion on something," I said after we'd exchanged pleasantries. "If someone's been pressuring elderly people to make risky investments, what would that look like?" Frank was quiet for a moment. "Harold, this about Christopher? Because I've heard some things." "What kind of things?" "Well, You know how it is in a small town. People talk. There's been whispers that he's been targeting folks right after they've lost spouses when they're not thinking clearly about money decisions. Claims he's helping them, but the investments he's pushing, they're complicated high-fee products that benefit the advisor more than the client. The pieces were forming a picture I didn't want to see. Christopher's increasing interest in my financial situation after Linda's death, his questions about my pension, my social security benefits, the life insurance policy, his suggestion that I might need help managing my money, that the world of finance had become too complicated for someone my age. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the printed pages spread before me, trying to reconcile the son I'd raised with the financial advisor who seemed to prey on people in their most vulnerable moments. The broken chair sat in my living room like a symbol I was finally beginning to understand. It wasn't just cruel humor. It was assessment. Christopher was measuring my stability, my independence, my ability to make my own decisions. The question that kept me awake that night was whether his Christmas gift had been the beginning of something, or if I was already deeper into his plans than I realized. The following week brought a phone call that crystallized my growing fears into something approaching certainty. It was Margaret Chen, the widow of my former co-worker Dave Chen from the electrical plant. Margaret and Linda had been close friends, and she'd been calling periodically since the funeral to check on me, the kind of genuine concern that felt increasingly precious in a world of calculated interactions. "Harold, I hope you don't mind me calling." Margaret's voice carried an unusual tension. "I wanted to talk to someone about something that happened, and Linda always said you were the most sensible man she knew." "Of course, Margaret. What's troubling you?" "It's about Christopher. He contacted me last month. Said he'd heard through the grapevine that I was struggling with Dave's financial affairs, which was strange, because I never told anyone I was having trouble. But he was so confident, so professional, said he specialized in helping widows navigate complex financial situations. My grip tightened on the phone. What did he want you to do? He had this investment opportunity, something called a variable annuity with guaranteed income riders. The paperwork was so complicated I couldn't understand half of it, but he kept emphasizing how it would provide security, how it was specifically designed for women in my situation. He said I needed to act quickly because the offer wouldn't last long. The script sounded familiar. Create urgency, exploit vulnerability, use complexity to mask unfavorable terms. Did you invest with him? That's just it, Harold, I almost did. I had the check written, ready to hand over $70,000, most of Dave's life insurance money. But something nagged at me, so I called my nephew in Chicago, the one who works for that big accounting firm. He took one look at the paperwork and told me to run, said the fees alone would eat up most of my principal over time. My kitchen felt suddenly cold, despite the furnace humming steadily. $70,000. The amount Linda's life insurance had paid out to me was $68,000. Margaret, when did Christopher first contact you about this? Right after New Year's. He said he'd been thinking about me over the holidays, worried about how I was managing. It felt caring at the time, but looking back. She trailed off, then added quietly, "Harold, has he approached you about anything like this?" I found myself hesitating, the same reluctance to voice my suspicions that had plagued me since Christmas morning. "Not directly," I said finally, "but he's been asking questions about my finances, expressing concern about my ability to manage things on my own." After Margaret hung up, I sat staring at the phone, pieces of a puzzle arranging themselves in my mind with sickening clarity. Christopher's increased attention to my health, his comments about my mental acuity, his suggestion that I might need help with complex decisions. It wasn't filial concern, it was evaluation, preparation, the careful groundwork that predators lay before they strike. I called Eugene Martinez, needing to talk to someone who understood both craftsmanship and character. "Eugene, that chair we looked at, you said someone had deliberately weakened it. What would be the purpose of that?" "Well, my friend, if someone wanted to make a point about reliability, about something not being able to support weight anymore, they might arrange for it to fail at just the right moment, create doubt about structural integrity. And if someone wanted to make a point about a person's reliability, their mental stability." Eugene was quiet for a long moment. "Harold, are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "I'm asking whether that chair was meant to be more than an insult, whether it was meant to be evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Evidence that Harold Peterson is becoming unreliable, unstable, unable to make sound decisions. Evidence that might justify someone stepping in to help him manage his affairs." The silence stretched between us, heavy with implications. Finally, Eugene spoke, his voice gentle but grave. My friend, if that's true, then you need to be very careful, and you need to start documenting everything. That afternoon, I drove to the county courthouse and requested copies of all recent property transfers, estate filings, and guardianship proceedings. The clerk, a middle-aged woman named Patricia who remembered Linda from various church fundraisers, helped me navigate the filing system. Mr. Peterson, can I ask what you're researching? Maybe I can point you in the right direction. I'm trying to understand how someone might go about taking control of an elderly person's finances, I said. Hypothetically, Patricia's expression grew serious. Are you concerned about your own situation or someone you know? Both, I think. She pulled several files from the cabinet behind her desk. These are recent cases where adult children have petitioned for guardianship or conservatorship over elderly parents. The process usually starts with documentation of the person's declining mental capacity, inability to manage their affairs, sometimes incidents that demonstrate poor judgment or dangerous behavior. My hands felt steady as I took the files, but inside, something was crumbling. The broken chair wasn't just cruelty, it was preparation. Christopher was building a case, creating a narrative of my decline that would justify legal intervention when the time was right. That evening, I called Walter Peterson at the tree lot. Walter, I need to ask you something important. If Christopher ever contacts you asking about my behavior, my mental state, anything that might suggest I'm not handling things well, will you let me know? Harold, what's going on? You sound worried. I'm starting to think my son isn't the man I raised him to be. And I'm starting to think that broken chair was just the beginning of something much worse. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my investigation had moved beyond curiosity into something approaching survival. The question now wasn't whether Christopher was planning something, it was how far along his plans already were, and whether I had enough time to protect myself before he made his move. The February wind cut through Springfield like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of a harsh late winter. I'd spent 3 weeks quietly gathering information, and the picture emerging was more troubling than I'd imagined. Christopher hadn't just approached Margaret Chen and Jim Hendricks. He'd systematically targeted at least 6 elderly widows and widowers in the surrounding counties, always with the same script about financial security and urgent opportunities. I sat in my kitchen with a manila folder spread before me, documents arranged with the methodical precision that 30 years of electrical work had ingrained in me. Bank statements showing Christopher's increased attention to my account activity through helpful questions. Printed emails where he'd expressed concern about my confusion regarding certain financial matters. Confusion I definitely hadn't felt at the time. The courthouse records showing how guardianship proceedings typically unfolded, always beginning with documentation of declining mental capacity. My neighbor Eugene had helped me install a small digital recorder, the kind journalists use, no bigger than a matchbook. If he's building a case against your competence, Eugene had said, his weathered hands gentle as he showed me how to operate the device, then you need to build one for your defense. The doorbell rang at precisely 2 o'clock, the time Christopher had specified when he'd called that morning. His voice had carried that particular tone of forced patience I'd grown to recognize, the sound of someone managing a difficult situation with professional detachment. Dad, I think we need to have a serious conversation about your future, he'd said. About making sure you're properly taken care of as you get older. Now, as I opened the door, I noticed things about my son that had been invisible to me before. The way his eyes immediately assessed my appearance, looking for signs of dishevelment or confusion. How he glanced around the living room as if cataloging evidence of neglect or poor judgment. The broken chair still sat where I'd placed it Christmas morning, but now I understood it differently, not as a cruel joke, but as a prop in a larger performance. Dad, you look tired, Christopher said, settling into Linda's old chair with the casual authority of someone accustomed to taking charge. Are you sleeping well? Eating regular meals? Ashley had come with him, carrying a leather portfolio that suggested this visit had been planned with the same attention to detail as a business presentation. She offered me a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression I'd seen on the faces of funeral directors, professional sympathy calibrated to the appropriate degree. Christopher, I'm fine, I said, settling into my recliner and discreetly activating the recorder in my shirt pocket. What did you want to discuss? Dad, I've been thinking a lot about your situation since Mom died. This house is getting too big for you. The maintenance is becoming overwhelming. And frankly, I'm worried about your ability to manage your finances effectively." The words hit exactly as I'd expected them to, but hearing them spoken aloud still felt like a physical blow. "My finances are fine, Christopher. I've been managing money longer than you've been alive." Ashley opened her portfolio and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Harold, Christopher has put together some options that might help simplify things for you. There's a lovely assisted living facility in Columbus, very upscale, where you could have your own apartment but with support services available. And your house," Christopher added, his voice carrying that practiced reasonableness that probably served him well with vulnerable clients, "could be sold to fund your care. The equity would provide a nice cushion for your golden years." I looked at the brochures Ashley was spreading on my coffee table. Sunset Manor, monthly fees starting at $4,800. In 6 months, the equity from my house and Linda's life insurance money would be gone, absorbed into the assisted living industry like water into sand. "What if I'm not interested in moving?" I asked. Christopher leaned forward slightly, and I caught something in his expression. Not concern, but calculation. "Dad, that's exactly the kind of thinking I'm worried about. You're isolated here. You're not eating properly. You're becoming forgetful about important things. Last week, you forgot to pay your electric bill. I paid it 3 days late because I was dealing with a problem at the bank," I said. "That's not the same as forgetting." "See, Dad? This is what I mean. You're making excuses for behavior that would be concerning in anyone your age. And that incident with the broken chair at Christmas, getting upset over a simple gift, making accusations about deliberate sabotage, it shows a pattern of paranoid thinking that worries me." The room fell silent except for the steady tick of Linda's grandmother clock and the distant hum of traffic on Route 72. Ashley's pen hovered over a document I couldn't quite read from my angle, but the official letterhead was clearly visible. "What's that paper, Ashley?" I asked. "It's just some preliminary documentation," she said quickly, closing the portfolio. "Nothing you need to worry about right now." But I'd seen enough to recognize the format, a petition for guardianship, probably already partially completed, waiting only for the right moment and the right evidence of my incompetence to be filed. Christopher stood up, brushing imaginary lint from his expensive suit. "Dad, I want you to think seriously about what we've discussed. This house is becoming a burden. Your isolation is affecting your judgment. And the longer you wait to make these decisions, the harder they're going to become." After they left, I sat in the gathering darkness of late afternoon, the assisted living brochures scattered on my coffee table like evidence of a future I had no intention of accepting. The recorder in my pocket had captured everything: Christopher's carefully constructed arguments for my incompetence, Ashley's documentation, the subtle threats wrapped in filial concern. Tomorrow, I would take that recording to someone who could help me understand my legal options. Tonight, I would plan my response to a son who had apparently decided that his inheritance was more important than my independence. The broken chair sat in my living room, no longer a mystery, but a symbol I finally understood completely. Christopher had shown me exactly who he was. Now it was time to show him who I still could be. The morning of February 15th dawned crisp and clear, the kind of day that makes even the most difficult tasks seem possible. I'd spent the weekend preparing for this moment with the methodical precision that had served me well throughout 3 decades of electrical work. Every wire connected properly, every circuit tested, every potential failure point identified and addressed. At 9:30 sharp, I walked into the law offices of Henderson & Associates on High Street, carrying a briefcase that contained 3 weeks of careful documentation. Sarah Henderson was Frank Kowalski's niece, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s who specialized in elder law and had built her practice on protecting seniors from exactly the kind of exploitation I was facing. "Mr. Peterson, thank you for coming in," Sarah said, settling behind her desk with the kind of focused attention that made me understand why she'd earned her reputation. "Frank told me a little about your situation, but I'd like you to walk me through everything from the beginning." I started with Christmas morning and the broken chair, then methodically laid out each piece of evidence I'd gathered. The FINRA complaints against Christopher, the pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly clients, Margaret Chen's near miss with the predatory annuity, the courthouse records showing typical guardianship proceedings. Finally, I played the recording from our meeting 3 days earlier. Christopher's voice filled the small office, professionally modulated but unmistakably manipulative. "You're isolated here, you're not eating properly, You're becoming forgetful about important things, getting upset over a simple gift, making accusations about deliberate sabotage. It shows a pattern of paranoid thinking that worries me." Sarah's expression grew grimmer with each revelation. When the recording ended, she leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "Mr. Peterson, what you've documented here represents a textbook case of financial elder abuse in preparation. Your son has been systematically building a case for your incompetence while positioning himself to control your assets. The broken chair was particularly clever. It created a situation where any normal reaction on your part could be characterized as paranoid or delusional." "So I'm not crazy," I said, relief flooding through me like warm water. "You're not crazy. You're the target of a sophisticated con game being run by your own son." She pulled a legal pad toward her and began writing. "Here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to document your complete mental competency with a thorough evaluation. Second, we're going to establish legal safeguards to prevent unauthorized guardianship proceedings. And third, we're going to gather enough evidence to report Christopher's activities to the proper regulatory authorities." That afternoon, I underwent a comprehensive cognitive assessment with Dr. Rebecca Torres, a neuropsychologist Sarah had recommended. For 3 hours, I completed memory tests, problem-solving exercises, and detailed interviews about my daily functioning. Dr. Torres's final report was unambiguous. "Mr. Peterson demonstrates cognitive functioning well within normal limits for his age group, with no evidence of dementia, significant memory impairment, or compromised decision-making capacity." Armed with professional validation of my mental competence, I made the call I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. "Christopher, this is your father. I need you to come over tomorrow evening. There are some things we need to discuss." "Dad, is everything all right? You sound different." "Everything is fine, Christopher. Better than fine, actually. Can you be here at 7? The next evening, Christopher arrived alone, which surprised me. He'd probably expected another confused elderly man conversation that Ashley's presence would only complicate. Instead, he found me sitting calmly in my living room, a manila folder on the coffee table next to the still broken chair. "Dad, you said you wanted to talk?" "I do. Please sit down." I gestured to Linda's old chair, the same spot where he'd presented his guardianship arguments 3 days earlier. "Christopher, I want you to know that I understand exactly what you've been doing." Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of wariness that he tried to mask with concern. "Dad, I'm not sure what you mean." "I mean the systematic campaign to establish my incompetence, the targeting of elderly clients like Margaret Chen and Jim Hendricks, the broken chair designed to make me look paranoid, the carefully documented concerns about my mental state." I opened the folder and withdrew the FINRA complaints. "I mean your pattern of exploiting vulnerable seniors for financial gain." Christopher's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and finally a cold anger I'd never seen before. The mask of filial concern dropped away completely, revealing something that made my stomach clench with recognition. "You've been spying on me," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "I've been protecting myself from you. There's a difference." He leaned forward, and for the first time in years, I saw the real Christopher, not the successful financial advisor or the concerned son, but someone who viewed relationships as transactions and people as resources to be exploited. "Dad, you have no idea what you're playing with here. I've built a very successful practice helping elderly people make smart financial decisions. If you're going to sabotage that with paranoid accusations and fabricated evidence." "Fabricated?" I played the recording of our last conversation, his own words filling the room with their calculated cruelty. When it ended, Christopher sat in silence, his jaw working as if he were chewing something bitter. "You recorded me," he said finally. "I documented the truth. Christopher, I want you to listen very carefully. I've consulted with an attorney. I've undergone a complete mental competency evaluation. I've reported your financial practices to FINRA and the Ohio Department of Commerce, and I've established legal protections to prevent you from ever gaining control over my assets or my person." The silence stretched between us like a chasm opening in the earth. Christopher's hands gripped the arms of Linda's chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "I'm your son," he said, and for the first time, his voice cracked with something that might have been genuine emotion. "Yes," I said quietly. You are. And that makes what you've done to me, and to people like Margaret Chen, infinitely worse than if you were just another predatory financial advisor. The room held its breath for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Christopher's face cycled through emotions like a man drowning. Denial, anger, calculation, and finally, something I hadn't expected. A kind of desperate defiance that reminded me uncomfortably of the boy who used to break things when he couldn't get his way. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under," he said finally, his voice stripped of its professional polish. "The mortgage on the house, Emma's private school, the country club dues that Ashley insists we need for appearances. My practice has overhead you can't imagine, and the market has been brutal for 2 years running. So you decided to prey on grieving widows and confused elderly men?" I kept my voice steady, though inside I felt something breaking that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. "Christopher, Margaret Chen almost gave you her life insurance money, $70,000 that was supposed to see her through retirement." "She would have been fine," he snapped. "The annuity had guaranteed income features. She would have received monthly payments for life, after fees that would have consumed 60% of her principal over 10 years. I pulled out the analysis that Margaret's nephew had provided, the one that had saved her from financial ruin. "Christopher, this is fraud. Sophisticated, calculated fraud that targets the most vulnerable people in our community." Something shifted in his eyes then, a hardness that made him look like a stranger wearing my son's face. "Fine. You want to play hardball, Dad? Let's play hardball. You think that recording proves something? You think anyone's going to believe a 72-year-old man over a licensed financial professional with 15 years of experience?" He stood up, pacing to the window that overlooked Maple Street, his expensive shoes clicking against Linda's hardwood floors. "I can have 3 doctors testify that you're showing early signs of dementia. I can document incidents of paranoid behavior, social isolation, inability to maintain your property. The broken chair? Perfect evidence of how you interpret normal gifts as elaborate conspiracies. Christopher," I kept my voice calm, though my heart was hammering against my ribs, "those doctors don't exist. That paranoid behavior never happened, and the broken chair was deliberately sabotaged. Eugene Martinez documented that in his repair report." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his features. He hadn't counted on me gathering professional documentation of his setup. "Dad, you're making a huge mistake. I'm trying to help you." "No." I stood up, feeling steadier than I had in months. "You're trying to control me. There's a difference, and I think you know it." The front door opened then, surprising us both. Sarah Henderson walked in, followed by Detective Mike Riley from the Springfield Police Department's white-collar crime unit. I'd called them before Christopher arrived, setting up this confrontation with the same careful planning I'd once used to wire commercial buildings. "Mr. Peterson," Detective Riley said, nodding to me before turning his attention to Christopher. "Mr. Christopher Peterson, I'm Detective Riley. We'd like to ask you some questions about your business practices, particularly regarding elderly clients." Christopher's face went chalk white. "I want my lawyer." "That's your right," Detective Riley said calmly. "But first, let me explain what we're investigating. We've received complaints from 6 elderly clients in 3 counties, all following a similar pattern, targeting recent widows and widowers, high-pressure sales tactics, complex financial products with excessive fees, and attempts to isolate clients from family members who might provide objective advice." Sarah opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder. "We've also documented a pattern of attempted guardianship fraud, including systematic efforts to establish incompetence in potential victims through staged incidents and fabricated evidence of declining mental capacity." "This is ridiculous," Christopher said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I'm a licensed professional. I help people make smart financial decisions." "Mr. Peterson," Detective Riley addressed Christopher formally, "you're under arrest for elder financial abuse, wire fraud, and conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud. You have the right to remain silent." As the detective read Christopher his rights, I found myself thinking not of the man being handcuffed in my living room, but of the 12-year-old boy who had saved his allowance to buy his mother a ceramic angel. That boy was gone, had been gone for years, replaced by someone who saw dollar signs where love should have lived. Ashley arrived just as they were leading Christopher to the police car, her perfect composure cracking when she saw the handcuffs. "Harold, what have you done?" "I've protected myself and other vulnerable seniors from a predator who happened to be my son," I said quietly. Ashley, you knew what he was doing. The guardianship petition, the assisted living facility arrangements. You were part of this. She looked at me with something between hatred and desperation. He's your son. How could you do this to your own family? He stopped being my son the moment he decided I was worth more to him controlled than loved, I replied. The question is, what kind of mother are you going to be to Emma and Mason when they find out their father preys on elderly people for money? As the police car disappeared down Maple Street, carrying my only child toward a future that would likely include prison time and the permanent loss of his financial licenses, I sat back down in my living room. The broken chair was still there, but it no longer looked like a symbol of my frailty. Instead, it looked like evidence of someone's miscalculation, someone who had underestimated the strength that can come from finally seeing the truth clearly. Sarah sat down across from me, her expression gentle but professional. Mr. Peterson, I know this was incredibly difficult. How are you feeling? I thought about her question for a long moment, watching through the window as normal families lived normal lives on a street where everything had just changed forever. Heartbroken, I said finally, but free. The weeks following Christopher's arrest passed like a slow-motion avalanche, each day bringing new revelations about the extent of his schemes. The Ohio Attorney General's office had opened a full investigation, and what they found painted a picture of systematic predation that extended far beyond what I'd initially discovered. 17 elderly victims across 4 counties, total losses approaching $500,000, and a network of assisted living facilities that had been paying Christopher referral fees for every placement he arranged. I sat in Sarah Henderson's office on a gray March morning, reviewing the latest batch of legal documents that would formalize my protection from any future guardianship attempts. The cognitive evaluation from Dr. Torres had been supplemented by 2 additional assessments, all confirming what I'd known all along. I was perfectly capable of managing my own affairs. The state's case against Christopher is solid, Sarah said, sliding a folder across her desk. They're offering him a plea bargain. 5 years in minimum security prison, full restitution to victims, and permanent prohibition from working in financial services. His attorney is recommending he take it. And if he doesn't, he's looking at 15 to 20 years. The federal prosecutors are particularly interested in the wire fraud aspects, and elder abuse carries serious penalties when it's this systematic. Through the window of Sarah's office, I could see Springfield's Courthouse Square, where daffodils were beginning to push through the last patches of snow. Spring was coming, bringing with it the possibility of renewal, but also the reality of permanent change. My relationship with my only child was over, not just strained or damaged, but completely severed by his choices and my refusal to be his victim. What about the other victims? I asked. Most will recover at least partial restitution, though it'll take time. Margaret Chen is getting back $73,000 of the $70,000 she almost lost. Christopher hadn't moved her money yet when we froze his accounts. The others are in various stages of recovery. That afternoon, I drove out to Eugene Martinez's house to thank him for his help and return the recording equipment he'd lent me. I found him in his backyard workshop, teaching his youngest grandson how to properly sand a piece of wood. The sight of 3 generations working together with patience and genuine affection made my chest tight with loss. "Harold, my friend," Eugene said, setting down his sandpaper and embracing me warmly. "How are you holding up?" "Some days better than others," I admitted. "Eugene, I can't thank you enough for believing me, for helping me document what was happening. In my family, we have a responsibility to protect each other," he said simply. "That includes chosen family, not just blood family. You needed protection, so we protected you." His grandson, maybe 10 years old, looked up from his sanding with curious eyes. "Abuelo, is this the man whose son was stealing from old people?" Eugene nodded gravely. "Sí, mijo. Sometimes even family members can make very bad choices. That's why it's important to always tell the truth and treat people with respect." Driving home, I thought about the concept of chosen family versus blood family. Christopher's betrayal had left me without biological descendants I could trust, but it had also revealed the network of genuine relationships that had sustained me through the crisis. Eugene and his family, who had offered practical help without judgment. Sarah Henderson, who had taken my case seriously when another attorney might have dismissed an elderly man's suspicions. Margaret Chen and the other victims, who had become unlikely allies in seeking justice. The house on Maple Street felt different now, not empty in the way it had after Linda's death, but peaceful in a way it hadn't been for months. The broken chair was gone, finally repaired by Eugene and donated to the church thrift store, where it would serve someone who needed furniture, not psychological manipulation. That evening, Emma called. My 16-year-old granddaughter's voice was shaky, clearly struggling with emotions too complex for her age. "Grandpa Harold, I don't understand what's happening. Mom won't really explain. And Dad is in jail?" "Yes, sweetheart, he is," I said gently. "Your father made some very poor choices about how to treat elderly people, and now he has to face the consequences of those choices." "But why would he do that? He's not a bad person, is he?" The question hung in the air like smoke, complex and impossible to answer simply. "Emma, people are complicated. Your father has good qualities, but he also made selfish decisions that hurt vulnerable people. Sometimes, when adults are under pressure, they choose money over doing what's right." "Are you going to visit him in prison?" I'd been asking myself the same question for weeks. "I don't know, sweetheart. Right now, I'm still processing everything that happened. What I do know is that you and Mason are welcome in my house any time, regardless of what happens with your father." After we hung up, I sat in Linda's old chair, the one where Christopher had presented his guardianship scheme just weeks ago, and thought about the strange mathematics of family loyalty. How do you love someone who tried to destroy your independence? How do you maintain relationships with grandchildren whose father attempted to defraud you? How do you rebuild trust when the person who betrayed you shares your name and your memories of better times? The phone rang again, interrupting my brooding. It was Walter Peterson from the tree lot. "Harold, I wanted you to know. The whole town's talking about what Christopher did, and the consensus is pretty clear. You did the right thing, son. Protecting yourself and those other folks took courage." "Thank you, Walter. That means more than you know. Listen, spring's coming, and I'm thinking about expanding the business into landscaping supplies. I could use someone with your organizational skills to help me set up the new inventory system. Interested in some part-time work?" The offer surprised me with its simple kindness, meaningful work, social connection, and the implicit message that my community still valued my contributions. "Walter, I think I'd like that very much." As I hung up the phone, I realized that rebuilding my life wasn't going to be about recovering what I'd lost, but about discovering what was still possible. Christopher's betrayal had ended one chapter of my story, but it didn't have to write the final page. 1 year later, I stood in my backyard on a crisp October morning, watching Eugene's grandson Pablo help me plant tulip bulbs that would bloom next spring. The boy had grown taller over the past months, his hands more confident with tools, his English peppered with the technical vocabulary he'd learned working alongside his grandfather and me at Walter's expanded garden center. "Mr. Harold, why do we plant these so deep?" Pablo asked, carefully measuring the spacing between bulbs with the ruler I'd taught him to use. "Because they need the cold winter to become strong enough to bloom," I said, thinking about how apt the metaphor had become. Sometimes the difficult seasons are what prepare us for beauty. The past year had taught me about resilience I didn't know I possessed. Christopher had accepted the plea bargain, receiving a 5-year sentence that he was serving at Southeastern Correctional Institution. I'd visited him twice, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of a need to understand how the boy who'd saved allowance for Christmas angels had become the man who'd preyed on vulnerable seniors. Both visits had been painful in different ways. The first time, Christopher had been defiant, insisting that everyone was overreacting to standard business practices. The second visit, 6 months later, had been worse. He'd been broken, full of apologies and self-pity that felt more manipulative than genuine. I'd left knowing that whatever reconciliation might be possible would have to wait years and might never come at all. But the absence of my son had revealed the presence of unexpected family. Emma visited every Sunday now, helping me maintain Linda's garden and learning to cook her grandmother's recipes. She'd struggled through her father's arrest and the family's financial collapse. Ashley had been forced to sell the Tudor house and move to a modest apartment. But she'd emerged stronger and more grounded than I'd ever seen her. Mason had taken longer to adjust, his 12-year-old mind struggling to reconcile the father he'd known with the father who'd stolen from old people. But gradually, he'd begun to open up during our Saturday morning fishing trips to Buckeye Lake. asking hard questions about right and wrong that reminded me of his grandmother's moral clarity. "Grandpa," he'd said just last weekend, his line disappearing into the still water. "Mom says Dad did bad things because he was stressed about money, but lots of people are stressed about money, and they don't steal." "That's right, Mason. Being stressed doesn't excuse hurting other people. Your father made choices, and now he has to live with the consequences." "Are you mad at him?" I'd thought about that question for a long time before answering. "I'm disappointed in him, and I'm angry about what he tried to do to me and other elderly people. But mostly, I'm sad that he chose money over family because that choice cost him everything that really mattered." Working at Walter's Garden Center had given my retirement new purpose. 3 days a week, I helped customers choose plants, troubleshoot garden problems, and share the accumulated wisdom of 40 years of coaxing life from Ohio soil. The work kept me connected to the seasonal rhythms that had always grounded me, and it put me in contact with people who valued my experience rather than seeing it as a liability. Margaret Chen had become an unlikely friend, bonding over our shared experience of narrowly escaping Christopher's schemes. She'd channeled her near miss with financial exploitation into volunteering with the state's elder abuse prevention program, speaking at senior centers about the warning signs of financial predation. Together, we'd helped identify 2 other fraudulent advisors operating in neighboring counties. "Harold," she'd said over coffee just last week, "I've been thinking about that broken chair Christopher gave you. At the time it seemed so cruel, but looking back it was the mistake that saved you." She was right. The chair had been Christopher's miscalculation, the one move that was so obviously malicious that it had forced me to see the pattern of manipulation I'd been missing. In trying to symbolize my weakness, he'd actually revealed his own cruelty, and that revelation had been the beginning of my salvation. The legal proceedings had concluded with restitution payments that allowed most of Christopher's victims to recover their losses. The ripple effects had led to stronger oversight of financial advisors in Ohio and new protections for elderly clients considering complex investment products. Sarah Henderson had been appointed to a state task force on elder financial abuse, carrying forward the lessons learned from cases like mine. As Pablo and I finished planting the tulip bulbs, I thought about the strange algebra of loss and gain that had defined this year. I'd lost my only child, my faith in blood family as automatically trustworthy, and my illusion that love alone could protect against betrayal. But I'd gained clarity about my own strength, deeper relationships with chosen family, and the knowledge that I could survive even the most fundamental breach of trust. The November elections were approaching, and I'd volunteered to work at the polling station at Lincoln Elementary School. At 73, I was one of the youngest volunteers, surrounded by women in their 80s who'd been managing elections since before I was born. Their competence and sharp attention to detail reminded me daily that age could bring wisdom rather than weakness, experience rather than incompetence. That evening, I sat in my living room with a cup of coffee and Linda's photo on the end table beside me. The house felt full rather than empty, populated by the ghosts of good memories and the promise of new relationships still developing. Emma would arrive soon for our Sunday dinner tradition, bringing Mason and sometimes one of her friends who'd become curious about this grandfather who'd stood up to his own son. Outside my window, the maple trees lining my street blazed with October colors, gold and scarlet and bronze, beautiful in their impermanence. Next year, those same trees would leaf out green and fresh, carrying no memory of this year's display. But the roots would carry the strength gained from weathering another season's changes. The broken chair was long gone, replaced by a sturdy oak rocker that Eugene had built in his workshop. It was a gift presented without irony or hidden meaning, designed to support rather than undermine, to comfort rather than condemn. When I sat in it, I thought not about falling down, but about the strength it takes to stand up, to remain upright when the people you trust most try to knock you over. Christopher had intended to break me, to reduce me to someone who needed management rather than deserved respect. Instead, he'd taught me that standing up, for yourself, for other vulnerable people, for the principle that family love shouldn't come with a price tag, sometimes requires cutting ties that you thought would last forever. The wisdom of standing, I'd learned, isn't about never falling down. It's about recognizing when someone is trying to push you over and having the courage to plant your feet, square your shoulders, and refuse to go down without a fight. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on your screen.